Welcome to the Faith and Arts Project, hosted by the University of North Carolina, Asheville and Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center. I'm Rick Chess of UNC Asheville. This project offers us an opportunity to explore the role of arts in spiritual practice and religious life, and the role of spiritual practice and religious life in the arts. With the Faith and Arts Research Project, we are presenting conversations with artists and scholars whose work may offer us fresh ways of thinking about the connections among religion, spirituality, and the arts in our time. These conversations will lead into the Faith and Arts Institute, which will be held on October 14th through the 16th, 2021. You can learn more about the project on the Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center and UNC Asheville websites. Again, welcome. Now, onto the conversation with Charles Hallisey. Charles Hallisey is a member of the Faculty of Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. His research centers on Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Pali language and literature, Buddhist ethics, and literature in Buddhist culture. His most recent book is Therigatha, Poems of the First Buddhist Women, published by Harvard University Press in 2015. He is currently working on a book project entitled Flowers on the Tree of Poetry, The Moral Economy of Literature in Buddhist Sri Lanka. He will be in conversation with Molly Silverstein, former member of Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center, poet, and currently a student at Harvard Divinity School. Again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for coming to this interview for Faith in Arts. So excited to get to do this with you in a very different context than we've been in before. Professor Hallisey, or Charlie, has been my professor at HDS. I took the Lotus Sutra with him, engaging in Buddhist scripture, and we also did an independent study together, or I did an independent study supervised by him. So anyway, so excited to get to talk to you and ask you some questions. So I think it would be great to start just with, I'm just curious about like any spiritual background of your childhood, or sort of like how you stumbled into or directly got into studying religion.
The general background on spiritual or religious background that I have, I think in some ways is unusual. A number of years ago, I saw an interview with the father of cultural studies in the UK, Stuart Hall, in which he was speaking about the first social fact that he was aware of with himself. And he grew up in Jamaica, and he said that what he became aware of was that his skin color was darker than other people in his family, and that it was a problem. When I heard him talk like that, I asked myself, what was the first social fact that I knew about myself? And what I came upon was that I was aware that I had a different religion than my parents. And the way that that happened is that my parents had what was called before Vatican II a mixed marriage. My father was Roman Catholic and my mother was not, and they had not been married in a Catholic church. And that was a problem socially for them. My father refused to confess that he had committed a sin by marrying my mother. And what it meant that when he died, he wasn't given a funeral by the Roman Catholic Church. He died a Catholic, but it was just their marriage was a problem within a Catholic community. By the time I was born, I think that they had had enough of it. And what they did is that they just sent me to the church that was at the end of the street that we lived on. And I went there myself. to Sunday school. I remember going to but I grew up in a kind of basically almost a Roman Catholic ghetto. And my father's family, my extended family, were all Roman Catholic. And I remember going to one of my cousins' weddings. There was a mass, and I don't think I was ever aware of like the ritual gestures, but my father knew them all and was doing them, and my mother was not. And I was just like, how do you know this? And how come she doesn't know this? And why don't I know anything about this? And so that general kind of background, that I had a different religion than my parents, and also that religion was a problem. You could say, well, there's some black box issue here that I ended up professionally studying religion. The other thing that I would say is that my father died very young, and I was very young. That he was 46, I had just turned 7. He had just turned 46, I had just turned 7. And that fact created, when he wasn't given a funeral and things like that. But the fact of his death, I would say, became part of whatever spiritual life that I had. And that when I went to Sri Lanka to do research about Buddhism, I was already studying Buddhism, people there would always ask me, why are you here? What happened to you? And when they heard about my death of my father, they always, lots of times people would say, oh, that's why. And that I would say, it was a good explanation. That what I encountered when I first became aware of the Buddhist world was something about a human nobility in the face of death. And that kind of is a bedrock for me of my interest in religion in general, and my interest in Buddhism. Something I would say, the possibility that's in front of us, that is at odds with the place where we find ourselves. And so that kind of contrast, I would say, is just part of my religious background and also my professional background as well.
It's funny, it seems like that's a theme emerging in some of our conversations, that this early acquaintance with death was a catalyst for studying or engaging in like intensive religious practice, which makes a lot of sense. I'm also curious to know, like, when did you always know that you wanted to study Buddhism? Like, I know that you went to Harvard Divinity as an MDiv student, and you were doing some like ministry work or chaplaincy. So what kind of path emerged from that?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, it was at Colgate University. One of my teachers there, John Ross Carter, invited one of his teachers from Sri Lanka to come and teach for a month at Colgate. And at that time, it was the 1970s, like education was more experimental, in many ways than it is now. So we had like a different kind of semester system in which we had like these special courses that were intensive for 1 month. And so this professor, I would say my first teacher in Buddhism, Professor Mahinda Balyawadna, came to teach as part of that. And basically, I had never seen anyone like him. I never saw anyone who thought like him. And that kind of held my attention. I didn't know anything about Buddhism, really. I had read Jack Kerouac. And I went to I had to kind of talk my way into the course with John Ross Carter. And I remember explaining I had read Dharma Bums. And his response was that Jack Kerouac to the Buddha is like a firefly to the sun. And so anyway, I started to study everything I could about Buddhism and Colgate. In terms of undergraduate majors, I was the only person in my graduating class who majored in religion. The department was philosophy and religion. You could major in philosophy and religion, or philosophy or just religion. I was the only one who did religion. I had an interest in studying Buddhism, and I went to talk about it with another teacher of mine, Kenneth Morgan, who had the idea for the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And so I told him what I wanted to do, and he said to me, it sounded fine, but the big problem was that I didn't know anything about the religions of the country that I was living in. So I said, well, that's true. What can I do about that? And he said, why don't you go to a divinity school? And if you don't have any money, apply for the degree, they'll give you financial aid. So that's what I did. And then when he said, just go for 1 year. But once I was at Harvard Divinity School, I thought, oh, there's a lot to learn here. There's lots of, and so I ended up getting a degree. So that's how I got the degree from Harvard Divinity School. It wasn't really my idea. There's a kind of pattern when I look back in my life, almost everything good that's happened to me wasn't my idea.
Yeah, I have so many additional questions. I wanted to just make sure to ask you, because we're doing this in collaboration with the Black Mountain College Museum, and you told me once that Black Mountain College was a catalyst for you in going into becoming a teacher, and yeah, just curious to know sort of how that, what impact that had on you and why.
At the same time that I was at Colgate and getting this interest in studying about Asia, studying about Buddhism, someone who's a close friend of mine gave me a copy of a new book by Martin Duberman that was about Black Mountain. That's called Black Mountain: An Experiment in Community. And so what it was, what was like eye-opening to me was the contrast between what Black Mountain College was aspiring to be and what the school I was at actually was. And it was also an unusual time for the history of Colgate University, in that it had expanded its student body, but it didn't have a dormitory space for a large number of students. So maybe about a third of the students enrolled were living off campus in the hills of upstate New York. And basically, it was an alternative university that was going on, where people were teaching each other. And so Duberman's book, which was really like a sincere exploration of the people who started Black Mountain College and then what it became, just became like an inspiration to me of, oh, a life within universities could be like this. I just had to find out where it was, but it gave me the idea that, oh, it would be like a good place to kind of pursue life, as, doing things like what was happening at Black Mountain College. And that book, I would say, periodically, I get discouraged about what I'm doing in universities and so on, and I reread it as a way of reminding myself, oh, this is what is still possible.
Thank you. Yeah. Your description of that makes me think of, it's probably very tangentially related, but makes me think of a lot of what we talked about in our Lotus Sutra class about sort of how do you define a scripture, and what is the difference between a scripture and a text, and what exactly is scripture? And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to what we came upon or talked about in that class, and maybe how it relates to the role of art in religion.
Part of my teaching life at Harvard Divinity School is that I teach classes on how to read Buddhist scriptures. That's just part of the requirements of it, one of the degrees at Harvard Divinity School. In that, I've taken up the insight of Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was a professor at Harvard Divinity School, in which he says, oh, we scholars don't know what a scripture is. And just trying to figure out, well, what's happening there. And what he establishes in my mind very clearly is that it's not an authoritative text. It doesn't tell you what to think, believe, or feel. But the scriptures are the kind of, they create conditions for some other kind of event that happens. Kind of the ideal type of the event is an anecdote that Wilfred Smith himself told about himself. He was asked, he was a scholar of Islam, and he was asked, has the Quran ever been a scripture for you? And he thought about it, and he said, oh, yes, once. And then he tells this story about he was teaching in India at the time of partition. The violence was overwhelming. His sense of what his future might be was gone. He had sent his family back ahead of him to Canada, and he was traveling on a ship alone in the Red Sea, troubled by what he was leaving behind and anxious about what lay ahead. And what came into his mind was the line of the Quran, "My mercy is more than sufficient for you," in which he said that he relaxed. He felt that no matter what happened, it would be okay. So that sense of, what scriptures are something like an event that happens that is transformative. Sometimes it happens in moments of life crises, like happened with Smith. But I think also it happens because people experiment with like reading the text in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes we might see them as abusive, the way that people are reading. They're picking out one line, one phrase, one quotation, like Smith and his crisis had, and taking things out of context. And basically what they're experiencing, something of a message that's being given to them that they need to hear at a particular time. It's that idea of experimentation that I would say, is running through when I think about what I'm doing, say teaching at Harvard Divinity School. The subtitle of Duberman's book, An Experiment in Community. One of the things that, say in the Lotus Sutra class, other courses on reading Buddhist texts, is let's experiment. And following other Buddhist readers from the past, in which they're just really good at experimenting and seeing different possibilities. And that, I would say, that kind of openness to surprise is part of my own sense of the overlap between aesthetic experience or art and religion. So this is one of the things that I think is that kind of I'm happy about. As a child, I never went to an art museum. I never went at all. No one took me to one. There wasn't something that adults did. And so when I was in high school, I kind of found out about them. It was the way that I would say, I found out about that there were libraries and that, you could get a library card. And then I found out about art museums and started going to ones in New York that I'd grown up on the outskirts of the city of New York. And so basically no one told me what you should do when you are in a museum. And so it was just like, I just couldn't believe the kinds of things that I could see that were possible. Then when I was at Colgate, there was a place there, the sister of the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions, which is a place for collectives, for groups to experiment. At Colgate, there's a place called Chapel House, which is a place for individuals to experiment. And it's filled with a library of works of religious significance, a music library. It has a chapel, you can stay there, and it's filled with art, incredible art. And so Kenneth Morgan was the director of it. I remember one time seeing him, and I said that I really liked looking at this one statue of the Buddha from Burma that was in the library. You have to correct it. It was actually from Vietnam. I'm confusing with another. But so I told him I really like that statue, and he said to me, "Have you ever looked at it sitting on the floor 11 inches to the left?" And so then I did that. And it was, I said, wow, it's all completely different. And so that sense of, that if you kind of switched up the ways that you looked at things, you could see other possibilities that were there. The other thing that happened to me working at Chapel House, because I worked as a substitute for the resident supervisor of the place when she needed weekends off. So before that, I had this idea that great art people shouldn't own great art. It should be in museums. That it was just like, a moral travesty that you had wealthy people who had great art in their apartments that other people couldn't see. But at Chapel House, I got to live with great art. And so sometimes I had to lock the doors, say at 11 o'clock at night, and things like that. So moving through the space alone in the dark, and I would see something about it, one of the pieces of art that was there that I hadn't noticed before. Then I said, oh, that's the reason why people want to live with art, that it becomes something that's constantly speaking to them.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That it's making me think of some of the ways that you were describing, like how scripture becomes scripture, or like the practices that people will do with the text that might be seen as abusive, but that actually are part of what makes scripture what it is for people. And I'm also thinking about Buddhist poetry and how that has been served a big role in your work. And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to the role that poetry plays in the history of Buddhism, and is poetry different than scripture? How does that how do those two things intersect? Is poetry different than doctrine in Buddhism? And what is the role of poetry there?
There's a way in lots of Buddhist history that in different times and places, different Buddhist cultures, what you see are Buddhist monastics, so ordained people, who have access to other kinds of spiritual disciplines, meditation, and so on, that they're very much involved in the writing of poetry. And when you're looking at it, you often feel that it's almost like an alternative spirituality that's existing within the tradition. And that you have some writers, they're particularly astute about what they're seeing. So there's one Japanese Buddhist monastic poet, Saigyo, a medieval poet, in which in poetry, he allows himself to look at things in the world that doctrinally are condemned by Buddhism, but in the poetry, he admires it. And so there's a great scholar who's written about Saigyo a lot, William Fleur, in his translations, what becomes clear is that kind of what I refer to as a dark Buddhism. It's a Buddhism that's like, dark matter that is present everywhere in the Buddhist world, but it just isn't lit up by doctrine. And so then you see this other kind of possibility of what Buddhist life could be like. The last few years, I've been working as part of a team project on the reception of a great literary theorist from India in Sanskrit, a man named Dundan. And Dundan, at the beginning of his work, which is about just what is it that poetry does? He has these two amazing statements. And one is that he says that language makes the world exist. And part of what it is that there's certain experiences that we have that only exist in language. And the second thing he says that language used well is like a lamp thrust into a dark room, that it lets you see what's in there. And so that you could say, oh, that's part of what people are exploring, is that how through literature, through poetry, a disciplined use of language, you see better of the things that are in the world and what's possible in the world as well. So that you say, oh, it's a kind of spirituality that's outside of doctrinal traditions, even though it's constantly aware of it and interacting with it. But the poetry is not just a vehicle for teaching Buddhist ideas, that they do things to the ideas as well. And you see a full range of Buddhist ideas that are happening that are being expressed in the poetry.
Wonder if the act of translation for you has sort of how that intersects with your understanding of the poems, or your experience of the poems, or the sense of the poems sort of creating or making the world, or creating a way of seeing, if in translating there's anything new that's come to you in that process.
I published a translation of a collection of poems by the first Buddhist women, a canonical text that's in the kind of Buddhism found in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, a text called the Therigatha. Again, this is one of the things, it wasn't my idea to do. Someone said, can I get you to do this? And it turned out to be really great for me. I'm really, really happy that I did it. But in order to kind of prepare myself for the translation, I read a translation by a great 20th century Sri Lankan novelist who in the 1950s himself translated some of these poems. In his own preface to his translations, where he's explaining why did he do it, it's a really striking phrase that I identified quite a lot. He said, it used to be that whenever I was happy being lazy, in which I have that experience a lot of being happy being lazy. And he said, I would let my hand fall on the books by the side of my chair and pick up this one book of poetry and sing along. And he said, no matter where I opened it, I always experienced pleasure. He said, now when I read the poems of these first Buddhist women, I experience the same pleasure. And that I'm translating in order to share some of that pleasure. And the way that he read the poetry and translated it was so forceful that it really kind of helped me to free myself from a kind of academic, philological way of translating, in which I was trying to show a window of what was in the original language, and instead to try to show something about what the poems were trying to say to people, to me, to others in the 21st century. And the one place that I remember really vividly is that one of the poems is by a woman, Ambapali, where she's remembering herself. And the conventions of the style of the poem is in what we could say love poetry or erotic poetry of South Asia, certain kind of patterns of descriptions of a woman's body that begins with the top of the hair and moves down to the feet. So she opens up and she says, it used to be when I was young, it used to be that my hair was curly and the color of bees, and now it's coarse and the color of jute. This novelist, Wickramasinghe, says that everyone says that this is about the Buddhist teaching of impermanence, that everything changes, and this is a source of suffering. And he acknowledges that's true. But he also says, but there are also, people are wrong, because what she's saying is, I was beautiful when I was young and I'm beautiful now. And then he says, oh, we can't see what she can see. But there's this other sensibility, this other possibility that when she says my hair is coarse and the color of jute, she's saying, I'm beautiful now. And so in that, you just say, oh, the poetry is trying to kind of demand, you have to catch up with me and see what I see. And so that possibility, I just say, oh, throughout the translation, it was always this kind of surprise where you're kind of getting close to a person speaking and you feel, oh, they're trying to tell me something that I don't know, instead of making it seem like what I already know. This is how it's Buddhist, and this is how it's a particular kind of Buddhism from a particular period. And so,
yeah, it strikes me that it seems like maybe that tension between seeing things like academically or fitting them into sort of a preconceived mold, and then seeing things and being able to see things anew or see how they speak to us now, that is very much like present in your approach to the field and which makes your approach so like exciting to, I know, me and a lot of students I'm just curious, like, I know you teach a class, or you taught a class recently on Buddhism and modern fiction or contemporary fiction. And I'm wondering, yeah, how you choose books for a course like that, or like, yeah, like, are you looking for, what are you looking for when you're thinking about a course like that?
That course is continuing, a kind of interest that I have of what's the place of literature in Buddhist cultures. And so in the modern world, Buddhists have begun to use fiction as a vehicle for religious reflection. And sometimes they are writing in their reflections, they are discovering possibilities to look at the world that they're in. And so then, so basically, again, we read a book by the novelist who translated the poems of the first Buddhist women in that class. And it's from the same time as he's translating those poems. Say it's something of a Buddhist period for him. But in it, the question he is raising is that something that if we saw someone who was truly Buddhist in our community, would we like it or would we be horrified? And so the protagonist of that novel is someone that you could say, and doctrinally, is a good Buddhist. But everyone around him perceives him as being a failure. And like making really bad life choices, and readers, you feel that way too. You just say, this is, and so that ability to kind of look at yourself, and fiction gives something of a mirror on where we find ourselves, to have something where you say, oh, I'm not sure what I think right now. And so almost all of the things that I'm picking out are books that are coming out of Buddhist cultures, including North America, Tibet, Japan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, China. And you say, well, why bother with fiction? Because it gives us another vantage point to kind of look at ourselves. And there's one book that we read by the great 20th century Japanese writer Yukio Mishima, that he has a 4-volume book work called The Sea of Fertility. And the premise of that book is there's 2 protagonists in the 4 volumes, one who keeps on dying when he's around 19, and the other who is aging naturally through all of the volumes. And the one who keeps on dying keeps on being reborn, and the one aging naturally meets him. And so the novel, in some sense, takes up, what would it be like to actually meet someone that you think is someone you knew from in their previous life, and the kind of doubts and confusions that you would actually have. One of the things that happened to me is that when I was about 19, undergraduate, getting interest in Asia, I took a course on modern Japanese fiction, and we read Mishima. And so I read the tetralogy when I was 19. And for some reason, I read it again when I was 38, in which I just couldn't believe how accurate it was about how I felt at that point in my life, which I didn't notice when I was 19. And I thought, wow, this guy is really, really good. Then when one of my sons was about 19, he got interested in Japan and started reading Mishima, and out of an attempt for me to have some, father-son contact, I decided to read it again. And again, I was just like amazed at like the way that he portrayed like the state of being in your late 50s. So that it wasn't just to learn about the Buddhist world. It was just where I said, oh, I went into this to talk about modern Buddhism, but I ended up thinking all kinds of stuff about how does this writer get to be so good that he can anticipate my experience?
Yeah, it's reminding me of some things that you've said about like Buddhist literature, poetry actually being like a form of among the Buddhist practices in like mental cultivation
That's right.
practices.
That's right. That's
Mm,
right. So
yeah.
that they are, religious disciplines that people are doing.
Mm.
And in those disciplines, they discover all kinds of things. So it's just truly amazing what they're seeing. And I'm always laughed by, how do they figure out how to do that?
Has artistic practice ever been a part of your life, your academic work, or do you see your academic work as related to that?
So I wouldn't say that I would see in my life anything about being a producer of art. Instead, I would just say that I'm someone who receives it, benefits from it. In South Asia, like the members of the audience are assumed to be just as kind of practicing their own like disciplines as like the artist who's producing things. So I would say that whatever path I have, I'm on the side of the people who are the disciplines of being in the audience and learning how to kind of participate in what's being created by the artists themselves as a way of the realization of the art in the world. And sometimes it's, what I can add to it is that I would just share to someone else. Did you see that? Did you see what was happening there? And in some sense that my amazement at what people do is part of their accomplishment. So.
Do you think there's kind of an abstract question? Do you think there's a difference between art or poetry that is like creating the world and art and poetry that is helping us see the world?
I'm not sure. So that I might intellectually try to trace that out. But in terms of experience, I don't think so. And one of the things of the creation of the world, I would say, is really quite mysterious. Remember a couple of years ago, I heard he's a superstar of South Indian classical music, a man named T.M. Krishna, who is incredibly self-reflective about what he does and what he's capable of doing. And he really is like a superstar, and his musical gifts are just amazing. So he was giving a lecture on what he does. And he had this incredible statement where he said, every once in a while, while I'm performing, and he used like air quotes, he said, music happens, like music with a capital M. And he said, I know it, the other performers know it, and everyone in the audience knows it. Music is happening. And then he said, and then it stops. And then he says, and then I just go back to dazzling you. And so that's one of the things where you just say, oh, that world that's created is not really up to the performer. The performer can dazzle. But this other thing that happens, is something that I think the audience, the performers, they all fall into and kind of yield to. And that kind of mystery of what's happening, I just can't get enough of. I remember, just to share with you, it's in the same realm. A couple of years ago at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, there was a very small show on paintings of Rothko. There's only about 10 paintings of Rothko. And I went there with someone, a friend of mine, and what was unusual about the show is that it gave you instructions about how to look at the paintings. So it kind of shared with you the discipline of how to look at them. And the paintings were, the black form paintings. There were some other things that kind of put them in the context of his life. And there was one thing by Rembrandt that showed that Rembrandt knew how to use like black tools, had the same effects as Rothko knew. But basically, what they told you is stand so many inches away from the canvas. They were these huge black forms, and look at them for at least 20 minutes. And so the person I was with and I, we were very obedient. There was like a little piece of tape on the floor, put your toes here and stare at it. And one of the things that happened was that at a certain point, like the colors black became different. And I would say that portions of the black forms began to have a kind of luminosity. And that I would say, the only way I could describe it is that it's white. Like it looked like a white waterfall going across the. So I thought it was just the retinas on my eyes, like kind of flashing because they were like bored at looking at this black too much. But I said to the person I was with, "Are you seeing anything in the upper right?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm seeing. It looks like a white waterfall." And so then I realized it's not just me who's seeing this. And then 20 minutes wasn't enough. We spent a long time there just kind of looking at different portions of it. And at the end of it my experience was, how did he figure out that you could do that? That through the layering of paints or whatever experiments he was doing to have this effect that you could just say, oh, that black, some black is white. And you say, oh, that's creating a world that really only is if you just walk through the room and you say, oh, another black painting, let's go on. Oh, another black painting, let's go on. But when you kind of take up like the discipline of looking at it, you say, oh, there's some kind of co-creation that's happening there. And that line that you may recall from the Lotus Sutra, that only a Buddha together with a Buddha realized the ultimate reality of all things, that you could say, oh, the artist and the viewer or the audience, it's only together that what is happening occurs. So.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and honestly seems like a good note to finish up on. Yeah, I can't think of a better way to tie it up for me than only Buddha together with a Buddha.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And just say, oh, that's what all education is like, only a Buddha together with a Buddha. So.
Yeah. And do you think? Well, I guess one last question. The only a Buddha together with a Buddha. How does that characterize religious experience in your mind?
The thing that, of that I am like so fascinated by, I love, is that interpretation of that line in the Lotus Sutra only is possible in Chinese. It's not possible in the Sanskrit that the Chinese is translating. Because the Sanskrit specifies number in the verb, you can't have an ambiguity. Is it one Buddha? So only a Buddha realizes, or only a Buddha together with a Buddha together realize. And you have that possibility of the ambiguity, just the grammar of Chinese that allows these Buddhist readers to kind of say, oh, this is what is going on here. And so that kind of, you could say, oh, the Chinese is a mistake. And you would say, no, the Chinese translation discovered the possibility that was always there. And that kind of process, I would say, well, that kind of surprise, that you just say, oh, this is like so correct. Everything, you know, once we see this, everything else now falls into place. So that's the you know, what the fascination for me would be, you know, how, you know, so the closeness, the nextness of the wrong and the perfect, you know, come in, you know, the perfect emerges from things that you say, no, that's just wrong.
Would you mind just saying the whole line, only a Buddha together with a Buddha?
Only a Buddha together with a Buddha realize the ultimate reality of all things. The Sanskrit would be only a Buddha together with a Buddha realizes. So the Buddha realizes, but the Chinese is, the way it's interpreted, only a Buddha together with a Buddha together realize the ultimate reality of all things. And so the implication of that is anyone that the Buddha is talking to has to be a Buddha already. It's not someone who is going to become a Buddha. It has to be a Buddha. So you know, all of East Asian Buddhism kind of tilts in a different way over just this kind of intense reflection on this possibility in the grammar in Chinese.
And it strikes me that somehow we could relate that to the Rothko painting of looking at something for 20 minutes and seeing a new possibility in it.
That's right. That's right. So it basically is to see a possibility in front of you that's different from the place where you find yourself.